The pilot's boots echoed down the first-class aisle like a gavel before judgment. Naomi Ellison didn't flinch. She kept her gaze trained out the window, where the sun was slipping behind the Potomac in one last brilliant blaze before surrendering to dusk. In the reflection, she could see his silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, confident in the way men who wear uniforms often are. He passed behind her without a word, but even in silence, she recognized the weight of his attention. That particular pause, that glance that lingered just half a second too long. She'd seen it before, many times, sometimes in marble-floored lobbies, sometimes in polished boardrooms, but most often in places like this, spaces defined by quiet luxury and unspoken social hierarchies, a place where the type of champagne you declined said more than the one you accepted, a place where certain passengers never had to show their boarding pass again after sitting down. And others always did. She adjusted the strap of her handbag, fingers brushing the smooth leather. Her mother's words came back to her like a low echo. Sometimes it's not what you carry, it's who thinks you shouldn't be carrying it. Her mother, who'd once been denied entry to a maternity ward in Baltimore despite her contractions, all because a receptionist didn't believe she had insurance. That kind of memory gets passed down. Not genetically, but cellularly, as if it clings to the bloodstream. Naomi leaned back into the comfort of seat 2B, letting herself sink into the Italian leather not as a guest, but as a rightful occupant. This wasn't indulgence, it was protocol. Her mission required discretion, speed, and a layer of protection that only first class provided. But even protocol could make you a target when someone decided you didn't look like you belonged. A few rows ahead, a woman with pearl earrings and a silk scarf adjusted her seat. Beside her, an older man in a navy suit was sipping bourbon, his laptop glowing with spreadsheets. Across the aisle, a teenager scrolled through his phone, earbuds in, oblivious to the tension quietly tightening around the edges. Taylor Jenkins approached with a practiced smile. "Dr. Ellison, may I offer you champagne before we taxi? Or perhaps a bourbon, if you'd prefer." Naomi looked up. Taylor's name tag caught the light, subtle and precise. "Sparkling water with lime, please," Naomi replied, her voice calm but sure. "Thank you, Taylor." Taylor blinked, just for a second. Surprised she'd read her name. Not because it was hard to pronounce, just not often acknowledged. "I'll be right back," Taylor said, a little softer now, almost respectfully. Naomi opened the front flap of her bag and slid out the worn copy of Meditations she carried on every flight. Marcus Aurelius was her constant stoic, unsentimental, clear-eyed about power and human frailty, a quiet anchor in the chaos of policy briefings and pre-dawn raids. Just 2 hours earlier, she'd closed a 9-month operation that dismantled a web of domestic financing tied to a cyber-terrorist ring. The press wouldn't hear about it. The faces on the monitors would vanish. But in a back room at the Department of Homeland Security, people would sleep easier tonight. Because she had done her job. And now, she was on her way to London, to brief their intelligence counterparts on what came next. The seat beside her remained empty for now. She preferred that. It gave her more space to think, to plan, to review the coded documents waiting on her encrypted tablet. But she allowed herself this moment of pause. The murmur of the boarding process was fading. Outside, the baggage carts trundled past, the last of the golden hour reflected off the fuselage. She closed her eyes. The cabin door hissed shut. The aircraft felt heavier. And then, the soft jingle of metal. He was back. Captain Travis Redmond made his re-entry like he always did, straight-backed, exuding presence. His tie was perfect. His hair, silver at the temples, looked sculpted. He moved down the aisle, shaking hands like a politician. He called one passenger Judge Wallace, another Senator McMillan, laughed with a corporate CEO. He moved through the first-class cabin as if it were his private club. Then he saw her. Naomi didn't look up right away. She saw him out of the corner of her eye, how his smile faltered. Just slightly. How his posture didn't change, but the cadence of his steps did. He passed her, but the glance lingered again. This time with calculation. Young. Black. Alone. He filed that away. She remained still, controlled. She wasn't going to meet that gaze yet. Not now. When Taylor returned with the lime water, Naomi offered a small smile. Taylor looked over her shoulder, as if to check whether she was being watched, then said in a hush, "Let me know if you need anything else." "I will," Naomi said, her voice steady. "Thank you again." The aircraft taxied from the gate. Naomi opened Meditations, thumbing through the marked passages. "You have power over your mind, not outside events," it read. "Realize this, and you will find strength." She did not know then how vital that line would become in just a matter of hours. The lights dimmed slightly for takeoff. The plane roared forward, lifting them into a night sky streaked with gold. Washington shrank below them, a patchwork of headlights and memory. The cabin lights adjusted to cruise mode. Passengers reclined, some already sipping wine, others adjusting pillows. Naomi kept reading. She felt a calm settle into her bones. She had done her job. She was prepared for the next. But trouble always found you in places where silence was mistaken for submission. 10 minutes after the seatbelt sign turned off, she sensed him return. The book lay open, the line she had just underlined still fresh in her mind. She lifted her gaze slowly. Captain Redmond stood in the aisle, arms crossed. "Ma'am," he said, the polite veneer barely covering the edge in his tone. "I just need to verify a few things. Would you mind showing me your boarding pass again?" Naomi didn't blink. She marked her page, slipped the book onto her lap, and reached calmly into her bag. The request was odd, but not unprecedented. She had handled odder. She handed the boarding pass to him without a word. He stared at it longer than necessary. "Dr. Naomi Ellison," he read aloud, his voice tinged with something skepticism. "Amusement?" "What kind of doctor are you, if you don't mind me asking?" "The kind who values her privacy," she said, not unkindly, but with a subtle precision that left no opening. He ignored her extended hand, waiting to take the pass back. "We've had issues lately," he said, his voice lowering, confidential now. "People sneaking into first class. It causes disruption." Naomi's posture didn't change, but something cooled in her eyes. "I assure you," she replied, each syllable sharpened by restraint. "I belong here." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "For airline security, I'll need to see identification to match this ticket." Naomi weighed her options. Drawing this out could escalate things. Quiet resolution would be faster, less visible, more strategic. She reached again into her bag, past the secured holster, past the flash drive marked Echo 7. Her fingers found the wallet. She pulled her New York State driver's license and handed it over. This, she thought, should end it. He took it, but his hand lingered on hers just a moment too long. And she saw it. Not concern, not confusion, enjoyment. He held the license up to the overhead light, squinting at it as if it were a counterfeit bill. He muttered, turning it over again. "It's a good photo. Very professional." Naomi said nothing. Let the silence speak. "This can be faked," he said, now leaning slightly closer. "Pretty girl like you, you'd be surprised what people do for a taste of comfort they haven't earned." He said it quietly, but not so quiet that the passengers nearby couldn't hear. Naomi could feel it, the shift in the air, the stillness. Taylor paused in the galley. A few seats up, Bernard Holbrook slowly lowered his glass. Naomi's breath was even, but her blood was iron in her veins. She opened her mouth, not to argue but to end it. "Captain Redmond," she said softly. "Return my identification to me now." The command startled him. But only for a second. His pride surged back like an undertow. "I don't think so," he said, bending the license slightly between thumb and forefinger. "This feels flimsy. Lamination's peeling." She saw it happening before it did. And still, she couldn't stop it. The plastic gave with a loud, deliberate crack. It sounded like a verdict. He dropped the two halves onto her lap like scraps. "Problem solved," he said, smug. "We'll have airport security sorted out in London. Enjoy your flight." He turned on his heel and walked away, as if the matter were settled, as if he had won, as if she were a problem he had just cleaned up. As the sound of his footsteps faded toward the cockpit, Naomi lowered her gaze to the broken ID in her lap. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. She placed the halves side by side, then folded her hands. Her eyes lifted. And something in her had shifted. She wasn't furious. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. As Redmond reached the cockpit door, she stood. Her movement was fluid, calm, precise. She reached into her handbag one last time. Not for the license, not for an explanation, for something else. He didn't see it yet, but he would, because now she was done letting this man write her story. He thought he had broken her until she stood. The plane hadn't left American soil, but the air in first class had already turned foreign. There was a strange stillness to the luxury cabin now, like a church, moments after the wrong sermon. The soft chime of silverware on porcelain had ceased. A flight attendant's footstep, once part of the ambient rhythm of the aisle, now sounded intrusive. And Naomi Ellison could feel it, the weight of 100 assumptions settling around her, tightening like a vice. She had trained for operations in volatile environments. She'd spent months tracking suspects across dark corners of cyberspace. She'd broken down syndicates with nothing but a file folder and her own intuition. But nothing prepared you for this kind of battlefield, the quiet war of humiliation played out under soft lighting, where the uniforms were crisp and the weapons were words. Her fingers brushed against the badge still hidden inside her bag. She wouldn't use it. Not yet. Not until it served the mission more than her own dignity. Her former instructor's voice drifted back from years ago, from the echoing halls of Quantico. Real power never needs to announce itself, but it knows when to stand up. Naomi knew. But the hour hadn't come. Not yet. The hush in first class was gradually broken by a murmur of voices. A businessman coughed into his sleeve. Someone shuffled a newspaper. And then Taylor, the flight attendant, stepped back into the aisle with a forced smile stretched too tight across her young face. She walked with careful steps toward Naomi, clutching a white napkin in her hands, as though it were a peace offering. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, crouching slightly beside the seat. Her voice was hushed, not just for privacy but for fear. He's not usually like this." Naomi raised one eyebrow. "Not usually like this. The most common defense for men like Travis Redmond." "You don't have to explain," Naomi replied gently, her voice so even it was almost disarming. "You didn't tear the ID." Taylor flinched, visibly. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She looked down at the broken plastic still resting on Naomi's tray table. She reached for it instinctively, then paused. "May I?" she asked. Naomi nodded. Taylor placed the halves into an empty air sickness bag, then sealed it with slow, deliberate fingers, as if handling something sacred or radioactive. Naomi took the bag and slipped it silently into her handbag. Up front, the cockpit door was ajar. Travis Redmond's voice echoed faintly as he joked with someone over the radio. You would never have guessed what had just taken place moments earlier. That's the thing about men like him, they left bruises no one could see. Naomi turned her attention back to her book, her fingers resting lightly on the pages. But the words blurred. The truth was, she wasn't reading. She was calculating. The plane had leveled at cruising altitude. Outside the window, darkness now covered the ocean like a heavy shroud. Below, tens of thousands of feet down, there was nothing but water and cold. Above, stars blinked indifferent. The quiet shattered again when Redmond re-emerged. She hadn't expected it. No one had. He came striding back into the cabin with the same arrogant posture, as if the cockpit hadn't been closed, as if he hadn't done anything that warranted a second thought. Naomi felt her spine go rigid. He stopped at her seat again, a small, tight smile on his lips, the kind you'd give to someone you thought you'd already beaten. I need to check something else, he said, like it was nothing. Just a quick confirmation. Naomi looked up from her book, blinking once. I believe you've confirmed quite enough for one flight. He chuckled. It's just that your name came up on our internal manifest. We've had issues in the past with people buying first-class tickets using reward points under someone else's credentials. You'd be amazed. His tone was smooth, almost casual. Naomi didn't answer. She waited. That made him nervous. Just enough. The silence drew attention. A few passengers looked up. Bernard Holbrook, seated in 3A, adjusted his glasses. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered. Tell you what, Redmond continued, we'll just clear this up once and for all. Why don't you tell me what you really do, Miss Ellison? She met his eyes and saw it. The real motivation. Not protocol, not safety, not even curiosity, just the desire to corner her in public, to unravel the composure that she wore so tightly. Naomi smiled, not warmly, but with something harder underneath. I file reports, she said coolly. Long, bureaucratic reports. You wouldn't be interested. Redmond didn't like that. His jaw tensed. Well, I'm responsible for the safety of every soul on this plane. And that means, then you might want to spend more time in the cockpit, she said, her voice suddenly sharp. Instead of harassing a passenger who's done nothing wrong. The word harassing hung in the air like a warning shot. Taylor froze in the galley, her hands half lifted toward a tray. Holbrook exhaled softly through his nose. Redmond's face flushed. You know, he said, the smile now completely gone. A pretty face and a confident tone can only get you so far. Naomi's blood chilled. He leaned in slightly, voice lowering to a whisper not meant for the others yet meant to wound. People can dress up, act the part, but at 30,000 feet, there's nowhere to hide who you really are. Naomi let the words hit, let them echo, but they didn't break anything. If anything, they cemented the truth. He wasn't trying to protect the cabin. He was trying to defend his illusion of control, and she was the threat he couldn't name aloud. Naomi slowly closed her book. Redmond saw that as a win. He began to pivot, back toward the cockpit, ready to claim victory. And then came the voice, not hers, not Taylor's, but Bernard Holbrook's. Captain? Redmond turned, blinking, caught off guard. Yes? He said, tone suddenly cautious. Sit down, Bernard said quietly. You're making a fool of yourself. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Every head turned. Bernard folded his arms. He He didn't look at Naomi. Didn't need to. The gesture was for her, but it wasn't about her. It was about a man in power, misusing it in front of witnesses. "I'll handle my cabin," Redmond replied, voice tighter now. "No," Bernard said. "You'll go back to the cockpit and let the crew do their job." Redmond's lips moved, like he was about to say something else, something sharp. But then he didn't. Because in that moment, it became clear. The cabin wasn't with him anymore. Taylor took a step forward, instinctively aligning with Bernard. Redmond saw it, and something shifted behind his eyes. Fear? Doubt? Naomi couldn't tell. Not yet. But she knew it was the beginning of something. He turned and stormed away, disappearing behind the cockpit door. Naomi let her breath escape slowly. Taylor met her eyes from across the aisle. A silent nod. Bernard said nothing more. He just returned to his newspaper, flipping the page with deliberate care. But the balance had shifted, and Redmond, in trying to assert control, had exposed just how little he had left. The sound of cracking plastic fills the cabin as Redmond snaps Naomi's license in half. He thought he had broken her until she stood. Naomi Ellison's movements were unhurried, precise, and deliberate, like a piano wire slowly pulled taut. As she rose from seat 2B, the book slipped from her lap onto the tray table without a sound, still open to a passage about the dignity of silence in the face of ignorance. The noise in the first-class cabin had long since faded. Now every passenger watched her, frozen mid-breath, as if the air itself were waiting to see what she would do. She didn't look at Captain Redmond, not at first. He had just returned to the cockpit, closing the door behind him with an air of self-satisfaction, as though dropping the curtain on a show only he had directed. Naomi's gaze was focused straight ahead, her posture calm, composed, unbothered. But the storm inside her was razor-sharp. Her left hand reached into the designer handbag at her feet, not with panic, not with haste, but with control born from 1,000 hours of training. No one moved. Even the faint rustle of the overhead vents seemed to pause as her fingers found the familiar edge of the leather case tucked between a lip gloss and a travel-size bottle of ibuprofen. Taylor Jenkins stood near the galley, frozen in place, her eyes wide with a nervous tension that only deepened when Naomi withdrew a small black case the size of a wallet and held it in her open palm. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't large. But it carried weight, a flick of her thumb. The case opened. The gold badge of the United States Department of Homeland Security glinted beneath the overhead light, the eagle's wings spanning wide across the seal. Next to it, a government-issued credential card bore Naomi's full name, her photograph, and beneath that, in bold block letters, Federal Special Agent. For a second, no one spoke. Then, Naomi's voice broke the silence, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, measured, authoritative. Special Agent Dr. Naomi Ellison, Department of Homeland Security. She let the words fall with the gravity they deserved. A gasp rose from somewhere near the back of first class. Bernard Holbrook lowered his newspaper, mouth parted slightly in astonishment. Taylor's hand flew to her chest as her eyes darted from the badge to Naomi's calm, impassive face. Naomi still hadn't looked toward the cockpit. Not yet. "The captain," she said, voice crisp as snow, "has just willfully and publicly destroyed federal identification issued to an active duty agent. He has done so in front of multiple witnesses, after repeatedly harassing me without cause and questioning my right to occupy this seat." Taylor took a step forward, uncertain. What does this mean?" "It means," Naomi said, eyes now shifting toward the cockpit door, "that the person currently flying this aircraft has committed a federal offense, and I am now relieving him of command." She turned to the cockpit and took a single step down the aisle. Not rushed, not aggressive, just a step charged with purpose. The cockpit door remained shut. But it wouldn't stay that way. Naomi looked over to the co-pilot, Eric Molina, still standing just beyond the partition, eyes fixed on the scene before him. "First Officer Molina," she said, "I am invoking Title 49 of the United States Code, Section 44904. Under that statute, I am formally relieving Captain Travis Redmond of operational command due to interference with a federal agent and compromising the security of this flight." Eric's mouth opened slightly. He hesitated, caught in the tension between fear and responsibility. But he'd seen it all, every step of the captain's slow unraveling, every misplaced word, every abuse of power. And now he saw the badge, the authority, the truth laid bare. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Naomi continued. "You are now the acting captain of Liberty Atlantic Flight 227. Please proceed with all standard protocol, and do not allow Captain Redmond to touch the controls, contact air traffic control, or issue any further directives until we land." "Yes, ma'am," he repeated, this time with more confidence. "Understood." The cabin rippled with murmurs. A woman clutched her pearls. A man across the aisle closed his laptop slowly, as though expecting it to be confiscated next. The mood had changed entirely. No longer quiet discomfort, it was awe, laced with a growing shame. Naomi turned back to Taylor. "I need you to retrieve the broken license fragments. Secure them in a sealable container. They're now evidence." Taylor nodded quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled for a fresh air sickness bag and bent to collect the plastic shards Naomi had earlier set aside. "Right away, Agent Ellison," she whispered. "Thank you," Naomi said, her voice softening just slightly. With Taylor moving, Eric now in control of the aircraft, and passengers slowly returning to breath, Naomi stepped aside and raised her badge once more. "Let the record show," she said. "This cabin is no longer under the illusion of arbitrary power. It is under the law." Behind the cockpit door, she knew Travis Redmond would be fuming, pacing in that cramped space like a caged animal. But he wouldn't come out. Not now. He wouldn't risk it. She could imagine him sweating under the weight of the moment, replaying everything he had said and done since she stepped aboard. He had mistaken her poise for passivity, her silence for submission. And now he was discovering the cost of that arrogance. Taylor returned, the sealed bag in her hand. "Here," she said, offering it like a sacred item. Naomi took it gently, placed it back into her handbag, and zipped it shut. The evidence was secure. The mission could proceed. As the plane soared silently over the Atlantic, Naomi walked slowly back to her seat. She felt every eye follow her, but she didn't shrink under the gaze. She let the moment settle, let it burn into the collective memory of every passenger present. Some would talk about it with hushed reverence. Others would struggle with their own silence. A few might even change. She sat down, crossed her legs, and reopened Meditations. As if nothing had happened at all, the silence in the cabin had never felt so loud. Captain Redmond, who had turned back with a look of supreme irritation, now stood frozen, his face a canvas of confusion. Even at 37,000 feet, the fall from power can begin with a single seatbelt click. The tension hadn't lifted. It had only shifted, like pressure in a cabin when the altitude changes too fast. Where there had once been disdain and condescension directed at Naomi Ellison, there was now something even more fragile and volatile. Silence laced with accountability. First Officer Eric Molina sat in the left seat of the cockpit now, his headset looped loosely around his neck, hands steady on the control yoke. He followed the established altitude, updated London air traffic control as required, and kept his eyes locked on the glowing instruments. Beside him, Captain Travis Redmond sat in the jump seat, no longer a commanding presence but a hollow silhouette, stripped of voice, stripped of purpose. He had buckled himself in slowly, each click of the harness echoing like a nail in the coffin of his authority. Naomi Ellison's words were still fresh in the air. "You are now the acting captain," spoken without rage, without spectacle, just with the quiet finality of the law. The flight continued over the North Atlantic. Below them, endless black water stretched like a void. Above, the stars blinked indifferently, the heavens refusing to concern themselves with human pride. Naomi sat quietly in her seat, flipping through the pages of Meditations, though she wasn't reading. Her eyes were trained, her mind processing variables. Every second she remained on this aircraft was one more in which the security of her mission depended on containment. Not just of herself, but of him. Across from her, Bernard Holbrook finally exhaled. He hadn't said anything since she revealed her badge. But now he leaned slightly toward her and offered a quiet sentence. "You handled that with more grace than I ever could have managed." Naomi glanced up, nodding once in acknowledgement. "Sometimes grace is the best armor." Taylor Jenkins reappeared in the aisle, her professionalism faltering only slightly as she addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be maintaining our course to London. Please remain in your seats unless absolutely necessary. Should anyone require assistance or wish to speak with a crew member about what they've witnessed, I will be available throughout the flight." It wasn't the standard announcement, but nothing about this flight was standard anymore. She met Naomi's eyes at the end, then turned away quickly. In the cockpit, Redmond hadn't spoken in over 20 minutes. His body sat rigid, but his mind raced, tumbling through years of flawless takeoffs and celebrated landings, through medals earned in the Air Force, through nights spent reviewing flight manifests with a sense of pride. None of that mattered now. None of it could shield him from the truth that was rapidly closing in. He opened his mouth, voice cracked. "Eric," Molina didn't answer. Redmond tried again, softer this time. "Eric, you've flown with me for 8 years." Still no answer. "I trained you," he added. That got a reaction. Molina's head turned slightly, though his eyes remained forward. "Yes, you did." "Then talk to me." Molina sighed, finally looking over. "I saw what happened. So did the whole cabin. You tried to humiliate a federal agent in front of 24 witnesses, Travis. I'm not going to risk my career backing you." Redmond's jaw clenched. "You think this is about race?" "I think this is about control," Molina replied. "And you lost it." The cockpit fell quiet again. Naomi, meanwhile, retrieved a slim satellite phone from her bag and moved toward the rear of first class. She spoke in code, her voice low but clear, shielding her communication from curious ears. "Nightfall is proceeding on schedule," she said. "Encountered unexpected atmospheric turbulence. Domestic situation is contained, but ground support will be required at destination. Standard protocol for agent interference. I repeat, the package is secure, but I'll need a reception committee." On the other end of the line, her contact at the Homeland Security Field Office in Washington understood immediately. Naomi clicked the phone shut and returned to her seat, the hum of the engines steady beneath her. Time passed. Another hour. Passengers dozed with eyes half open, unable to fully relax. Some clutched blankets tighter. Others kept their gaze fixed on Naomi, watching her like a sentry, quiet, composed, unmistakably in command. Taylor approached again with a tray. "Would you like something warm, Agent Ellison? We have chicken or lentil stew tonight." Naomi shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you." I just want to say again, I'm sorry." "You don't need to apologize for him," Naomi said. "You stepped forward when it mattered." Taylor nodded, But the weight of what she had witnessed hadn't left her. She walked away slowly, delivering drinks with a distracted smile that didn't reach her eyes. At the front of the aircraft, Eric adjusted a knob on the console and opened a soft channel with air traffic control. London Center, Liberty Atlantic Flight 227. Requesting coordination for isolated hardstand upon arrival. Repeat, isolated hardstand required. Copy that, 227, came the clipped British accent on the other end. Any additional support needed? Confirm law enforcement presence at gate. Notify customs. This is an internal protocol incident. Naomi heard that too. She let out a breath, and for the first time since takeoff, leaned back into her seat. The mission was secure. She wasn't sure if Redmond knew yet that the walls were closing in, that the consequences of his choices were about to land as surely as the aircraft itself. But he would, because at this altitude, there was no place to run, no airstrip long enough to outrun the truth. Redmond whispered again, his voice a threadbare thing. Don't let them take my license. Don't let them ruin me. Molina didn't even respond. Instead, he focused on the approach checklists, hand steady, voice calm, as he read the procedures that would bring the aircraft safely down. The glint of lights appeared through the windscreen, distant, then closer. London waited. Out there, on the runway, the end of Redmond's career stood in uniform, and Naomi Ellison would be the one to meet it head-on. Out the cockpit window, the blinking lights of Heathrow appear like judgment waiting. He always imagined the runway as a place of triumph, not trial. But for Captain Travis Redmond, the glow of Heathrow's approach lights now looked less like a welcome and more like a summons. The aircraft descended steadily, a polished bird of steel and protocol gliding toward a landing none aboard would forget. For Redmond, the sky had always been a kingdom where he reigned, unquestioned. Today, the earth waited not to greet him, but to judge him. Inside the cabin, the mood had shifted from anxious curiosity to solemn awareness. The passengers knew something extraordinary had taken place, knew they were witnesses to a quiet reckoning in real time. Naomi Ellison hadn't said another word since her call. She didn't need to. Her silence was now a force unto itself. Taylor Jenkins moved softly through the cabin, checking seatbelts with a respectful nod to each traveler. When she reached Naomi's row, their eyes met. 10 minutes, Taylor said quietly. Naomi nodded once, her focus razor-sharp. Every instinct in her warned that the landing would not be the conclusion, it would be the ignition of the next phase. Up in the cockpit, Eric Molina conducted the descent briefing with robotic precision. He spoke to the tower with the calm cadence of a man who knew his duty. But even he couldn't ignore the presence of Redmond slumped just behind him in the jump seat, shoulders drawn up like a man shrinking under invisible weight. The plane dipped below the cloud line. London's sprawl of sodium lights and winding streets unfolded like a glowing maze beneath them. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump that belied the turmoil within. But instead of turning toward the terminal, the aircraft began veering left, following a discreet follow-me vehicle with pulsing yellow lights. The first-class passengers looked out their windows and saw the deviation. They saw what waited for them on the remote stand. 2 black sedans, a dark blue van with a seal on its door, and a small contingent of figures in dark suits standing in stiff formation. A few gasps rippled down the aisle. Naomi calmly unbuckled her seatbelt. In the cockpit, Redmond pressed a trembling hand to the side window, watching the figures come into view. His breathing turned shallow. "This isn't how it ends," he muttered, barely audible. Eric said nothing. He taxied to the instructed position, powered down the engines, and engaged the parking brake with a clean, final click. Cabin secure, he said into the intercom. Ground crew in position. Naomi rose to her feet and walked with steady steps toward the forward galley, her blazer smoothing behind her. Taylor opened the cockpit door for her. I need the cockpit cleared, Naomi said. Eric stood and nodded. It's all yours. Redmond didn't move. Not until Naomi stepped inside. Her presence seemed to pull the remaining air out of the room. He looked up at her, not angry, not indignant, just small, as if he'd aged 20 years in one flight. Don't do this, he whispered. Naomi stared at him, not with malice, but with clarity. You did this, she said, voice low and sharp. You did it the moment you decided your bias meant more than the rules that govern every flight. The moment you tore up a badge that wasn't just plastic but power. Power you didn't understand. He blinked rapidly. I made a mistake. No, she said. You made a choice. Behind her, the sound of the main cabin door opening filled the air, followed by the muffled footsteps of government shoes on metal steps. Taylor reappeared. They're here, she said softly. A tall man in a dark suit entered first, his expression unreadable but unmistakably official. Agent Ellison? He asked. Yes, she replied, stepping aside. Captain Redmond is to be relieved of command. He is no longer authorized to speak on behalf of this airline or operate in any capacity involving passenger safety. Two more officials stepped in behind, one with a badge clipped to his lapel, the other holding a thin folder. Naomi turned to Redmond one final time. Exit the aircraft quietly, she said. No handcuffs. That comes later. He stared at her, his lips twitching with something close to denial, but no words came. The officials moved in. One gently tapped Redmond's elbow. Sir. He stood, movements slow and pained, as if gravity itself had grown heavier. His pilot's hat was gone, his tie slightly askew. As he stepped into the aisle, the lights from the open cabin cast long shadows down the narrow corridor. He looked back once, his eyes meeting Naomi's. In them, a flicker of confusion, a wordless plea, a question that would never be answered. She gave him none. He walked down the steps, flanked by silence and the watching eyes of everyone on board. From the windows, the passengers watched as Redmond was guided toward one of the black sedans. The door opened. He paused for the briefest of moments, as if waiting for someone to stop him, to explain, to save him from the consequences of his own decisions. No one did. The door shut with a cold, final thud. Inside the cabin, Naomi turned to Taylor. Begin passenger disembarkation. This flight is now closed. Taylor nodded and moved swiftly. The image of Redmond disappearing into the back of that sedan would remain imprinted on the minds of all who watched, not because he was dragged or shackled, but because he was left standing alone. And that kind of silence was the loudest punishment of all. Naomi took her seat again, pulled out her file folder, and quietly began preparing for her next briefing. Please remain seated until instructed otherwise. This will be handled as quickly as possible. It didn't take handcuffs to make the headlines, just silence, truth, and a federal seal at the gate. Morning fog clung to Heathrow's outer tarmac like a second skin, diffusing the sun into a muted haze as Naomi Ellison stepped down from Liberty Atlantic Flight 227. She descended the aircraft stairs with a calm that betrayed none of the magnitude of what had just occurred. Behind her, federal agents escorted Travis Redmond away in an unmarked sedan. No sirens, no shouting, just the quiet unraveling of a man who thought his sky-high tenure made him untouchable. By the time her shoes touched the pavement, press cameras were already clicking from behind the perimeter fence. A whisper had traveled faster than the plane itself. It wasn't yet a public scandal, but something had stirred, and London's ground crew had noticed. Naomi handed her credentials to a waiting official, who reviewed them with visible tension in his posture. "Ma'am, you're expected at the consulate. Transport is waiting," he said. She nodded, offered a small thanks, and stepped into the waiting black SUV, its windows darkened like her mood. From the rearview mirror, her own reflection stared back, composed, focused, but undeniably weary. She knew what came next: the paperwork, the internal investigation, the ripple effects in a system desperate to pretend it had no cracks. As the car pulled onto the service road, Naomi glanced once at the aircraft behind her, grounded now not by mechanical failure, but by moral consequence. Elsewhere in the terminal, Taylor Jenkins sat stiffly at a holding area desk, sipping bitter tea from a paper cup. She had been debriefed, questioned, and instructed not to speak to the press. She hadn't spoken much at all, really not since she watched the moment the man she once admired as a father of the skies crumple under the weight of his own arrogance. A colleague approached her cautiously. "You okay?" Taylor managed a thin smile. I never thought I'd see a captain stripped of his wings like that." "He wasn't stripped," her colleague replied gently. "He gave them away." Meanwhile, inside the consulate's secured office suite, Naomi sat opposite Deputy Director Monroe from the Department of Homeland Security. A compact man with sharp features and sharper ethics, Monroe had read the incident report twice and was now thumbing through it again. "No one's disputing your authority, Agent Ellison," he said. "Your credentials were valid, your restraint commendable. What troubles me is the reaction of the crew and the passengers." Naomi arched a brow. "You mean the silence, or the complicity?" He nodded slowly. "I mean the pattern." Naomi sat straighter in her chair. That wasn't the first time Redmond acted that way, just the first time someone stopped him. Monroe closed the file. The flight manifest included 3 senior staffers from the airline's operations board. They'll be reporting back to New York by noon Eastern. There's no containing this, Naomi. "I'm not trying to contain it." He gave her a long, measured look. "You do realize this could become the next headline?" Naomi didn't flinch. "Good." By late afternoon, back across the Atlantic, the ripple had reached the boardrooms of Liberty Atlantic's Manhattan headquarters. The executive suite buzzed with tension as Chairman Eliza Hart reviewed early press inquiries with growing alarm. A leaked photograph of Redmond being escorted from the plane, face half covered by his own hand, was already circulating in private forums. The media hadn't pounced yet. But it was coming. Eliza summoned the general counsel, PR director, and head of compliance into a closed-door meeting. "We need to get ahead of this," she snapped. "This is not about one flight, it's about culture. We either confront it or get eaten alive by it." The PR director hesitated. "Should we release a statement?" "Not yet," Eliza said. "Not until I speak to her myself." And so the call came. Back in London, Naomi's phone buzzed while she stood under a dull skylight in the embassy's garden courtyard. She let it ring once, twice, then answered. "This is Ellison." "Agent Ellison, this is Eliza Hart, chair of Liberty Atlantic," came the voice, polished, careful, and not used to apologizing. Naomi didn't interrupt. "I'd like to speak directly," Eliza continued. "I believe we owe you not just an explanation, but a change. Would you consider flying back to New York as a guest of the board?" Naomi looked out at the steel-gray clouds rolling over the city. "I'll consider it," she said. "But understand something, Ms. Hart. This isn't a PR fix, it's a reckoning." There was a pause. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." Later that night, as London slipped into rain and headlines whispered louder, Naomi stood in her hotel room alone. She watched a muted television screen flicker through early reports. Federal agent detains pilot in mid-air conflict. Homeland Security confirms investigation. Was this flight about protocol or prejudice? She turned the screen off. In the silence, she opened her laptop, clicked open a new file, and began to type her report. It was clinical. Precise names, times, commands, violations. But beneath the lines of text ran something deeper. A quiet conviction. This wasn't just about a flight. It was about all the moments that came before it. The side eyes at gates, the questions that didn't get asked of anyone else, the uniforms that conferred power until the wrong skin wore them. It was about the stories too often buried at cruising altitude. Tomorrow she'd board another flight. But tonight, Naomi Ellison wrote with the full weight of justice behind her, and tomorrow, Liberty Atlantic would read every word. It began, as many stories of injustice do, in silence. A silence so ordinary, so brushed off by routine, that it nearly went unnoticed. A federal agent stepped onto a commercial flight, an aircraft she was licensed to inspect, authorized to secure, and found herself met not with respect, but with suspicion, not with protocol, but with presumption, not with collaboration, but with quiet disdain. Naomi Ellison didn't wear her authority loudly. She didn't need to. Her power rested not in shouting or spectacle, but in the calm clarity of her presence, and in the strength of knowing who she was even when others tried to deny it. Captain Travis Redmond didn't see her that way. To him, she was a disruption to his order, an uninvited presence he didn't believe needed to be there. And in his world, confidence from someone like Naomi was too often mistaken for challenge. He tore up her badge. He tried to erase her authority with a single act of condescension. He wanted to shrink her. He ended up shrinking himself. Naomi could have exploded, could have shouted, made a scene, fought fire with fire. But she didn't. She waited. She documented. She moved with precision and calm. That was her strength, not just in her position, but in her restraint. And in that quiet power, she revealed something far more uncomfortable than rage. She revealed the system, the culture, the complicity, the way institutions protect the familiar face of authority, even when it turns ugly. She wasn't alone. Taylor Jenkins, the young flight attendant who once admired Redmond, stood at a crossroads of conscience. She could have ignored the moment, could have averted her eyes. Instead, she stood beside truth, not with grand speeches, but with subtle defiance, letting the truth unfold, letting decency take the lead. Taylor chose to protect dignity over tradition, and that choice echoed far beyond her own role. Passengers watched, unsure at first, but they remembered. The silence they kept on that flight would later turn into questions. Why didn't they act sooner? Why did it take a federal badge to wake them up to the casual erosion of respect that happened right before their eyes? Redmond was removed, not with cuffs, not with drama, but with silence. The kind that pierces deeper than noise. The kind that follows a man when he realizes he's not a hero anymore, not even to himself. But this wasn't just about one captain on one plane. It was about every moment a black woman walks into a room and is assumed to be out of place. It was about every time a uniform doesn't protect you, but paints a target. It was about the layered, unseen policies, unwritten and yet deeply practiced, that determine whose voice gets heard and whose authority gets questioned. It was about the difference between having a protocol and having principles. Liberty Atlantic faced the reckoning Naomi promised. Not just with public statements or HR-led seminars, but with real structural change. Internal investigations, public apologies, cultural shifts in training. Redmond's name would never again fly with the airline. But more importantly, neither would his assumptions. And Naomi? She returned home not with vindication, but with purpose. Because justice isn't a victory, it's a responsibility. one that must be carried long after the headlines fade. She never asked to be the center of a storm, but when the skies turned, she didn't hide. She held steady. She flew through it. Because that's what strength looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to be small in the face of it. To the older Americans who hear this story and remember how many times they were told to sit down, be quiet, wait their turn, you already know what Naomi knew. Sometimes dignity is the loudest form of resistance. To the bystanders who once stayed quiet, let this be your invitation to speak. To the allies who already are, thank you. The journey is long, but justice walks because you walk with it. And to those still sitting in positions of comfort, ignoring the culture around them, know this: change doesn't knock politely. Sometimes it boards your plane and rewrites your flight plan. The heart of this story beats with one clear truth. Respect isn't granted by position. It is measured by how you treat those whose power you underestimate. In the end, the uniform didn't make Redmond, and it didn't make Naomi either. Character did. And her kind of character? It flies higher. If you felt the weight of this story, if you believe dignity matters more than status, then leave a number 1 in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories where truth rises and justice lands where it belongs, subscribe to our channel. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest flight paths, and the philosophy remains: silence in the face of injustice is complicity, but quiet strength is power.